With our UltraSAFE, we really designed it to be incredibly easy to use because we know that the ORs are constantly rolling over staff. And so that was one really important facet, is to make sure that it was easy to use, that it was effective, and that it was going to really mitigate the risk for these employees, and then it functions well and fits in the workflow.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this Vendor Spotlight, Melanie and I are going to be speaking with Michelle Bell, Applications Manager at Milestone Medical, and we're going to dive in to formalin exposure. And many of you may be familiar with formalin from when you're taking specimens and sending them off to the lab. But today, Melanie, we're not only going to be talking about an innovative product that can standardize and reduce risk for the employees, but also we're going to be educating on the risks of exposure today.
I'm excited to have this conversation because I know I didn't get it when I started in the operating room. I wasn't told much other than, here, you take the specimen, put it in the cup, and go over here and turn on the spigot and get the formalin and send it off to where it's supposed to go. And that's kind of about it. So I don't know if anybody else is in my shoes, but I'm sure if that's what I was taught at my OR, somebody else was taught the same thing. So I think it's great to provide the education about this chemical and about the way we can handle it safely, but also a great solution to make sure that our specimens are being treated properly after they're collected.
All right, well, don't go anywhere. Formalin is a class 1 carcinogen, and we are going to be talking about what that risk might be to you working in the operating room and how to mitigate those risks with Michelle Bell coming up next.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
We are speaking now with Michelle Bell, Applications Manager at Milestone Medical, and we're going to be talking about formalin today and exposure risks to fumes for OR staff. So, Michelle, we're really excited to have you on to talk about this important topic, and just want to welcome you to the First Case podcast.
Thanks so much, Justin. I'm really happy to be here.
Michelle, can you tell everyone about yourself and your role with Milestone before we get started?
Sure. So my name is Michelle Bell, as Justin mentioned, and I am the applications manager for Milestone. My job is to install and train users on our instrumentation. I also follow up after the sale to ensure that they're happy with the units, and we do a lot of high-touch customer interactions in my department. I've been working in pathology for over 20 years, so I'm very familiar with the landscape, and formalin is something that we're always battling the exposure to. So,
yeah, I think that high touch with the customers, especially training, on equipment and the usage of equipment, is really so critical, because think of just about how much stuff comes in terms of equipment for the OR, how many processes change on a regular basis, and just keeping, especially those bigger facilities, everybody on the team informed and aware. And we're going to be talking a lot about that, because speaking of being informed and aware, we're going to talk a lot about sort of the risks associated with formalin and why Milestone Medical began to address sort of that exposure risk. And before we do that, can you tell us about the company? I mean, we're obviously going to be talking about UltraSAFE, but let's talk about the company first. What's some of the background?
Sure. So Milestone Medical was established in Bergamo, Italy in 1988. Our founder is just very passionate about patient care as well as the safety of the end user of the instruments. And so what he saw was just a real lack of that sort of insight in the market. And so he decided to start his own company with those being our core values.
And what about the UltraSAFE? Because I know the company, as you mentioned, you've got a long history and experience in pathology, but UltraSAFE is, a little bit different than maybe some of the other products that you sell. So what kind of led you down that path?
So our company has always been devoted to laboratory equipment. Part of that, though, is working with the OR to manage specimens. And what we saw was a lack of any kind of safety surrounding the OR nurses. So there was no concern over their exposure to the formalin in the OR suite when they were managing these specimens and preparing them for pathology.
So one of the exposure topics that I think has gotten probably the most attention recently has been surgical smoke. And we're starting to see legislation being passed around that. And I think calling more and more attention to employee safety. It's this funny thing that us nurses do is we put the patient first. And sometimes our own safety could be a secondary consideration. But I do think there's a lot more awareness for this. And I just kind of want to commend you for being aware of that safety issue and addressing it. So let's talk about that even more in depth, right? You saw this in the practice of, dealing with the specimens, that there was a potential exposure risk and a staff safety issue around formalin. But what is that risk? And can you give us some more details and background on it?
Sure. So most people are aware at this point that formalin and formaldehyde are a class 1 carcinogen. What that means is that it is a known cause for cancer. So exposure to it, either via the skin or inhalation, puts you at risk for cancer. And we know that it's an established fact. So there are certain limits that are set up for exposure times and amounts. However, it's really not well monitored. And so what we decided as a company was that this was a worthy endeavor for us to eliminate that risk or at least mitigate it significantly.
I have a lot of experience in various departments, and I've had a lot of conversations around chemical exposure and monitoring. And it's really one of those things that I'd say is on the lower end. I think back to sterile processing departments and monitoring exposure to ethylene oxide and kind of wearing a badge that would take a look at, what your exposure might be. And I'm kind of wondering, when you talk about managing this risk related to formalin exposure, like what are some of the current practices? Before you brought UltraSAFE to market, how did we manage that without this solution?
So before UltraSAFE was available in the market, the standard practice was to have a cube of formalin. It's a 5-gallon cube, setting on a counter, usually about eye level. And then we're filling buckets or specimen containers that contain the specimen. And so we're basically using a spigot on that cube of formalin. When we do that, we're exposing ourselves to several things. The first thing we're exposing ourselves is to the fumes of the formalin, which obviously inhalation is definitely an exposure incident. And so the other thing that we're exposing ourselves to is the splash from the fluid just free flowing into the containers. And then on top of that, there's always the risk of the dropping of a specimen accidentally, and then at that point you have a confirmed spill that has to be contained.
It seems to me like the awareness is low here because there are a few different potential exposure risks, and then obviously you can contaminate the specimen in this case. So what's being done to sort of increase the awareness of this risk?
The AORN has done a really wonderful job for advocating for OR nurses. And what they've done as far as specimen management is they've added this to their AORN guidelines that this formalin exposure should be mitigated as much as possible. And of course, you can't get rid of formalin because it is the accepted standard, right? It's the gold standard for processing our specimens. So we can't eliminate the challenge. So what do we do if we can't eliminate it? We try to limit the exposure to risk. And our UltraSAFE does that. It mitigates the exposure to risk for formalin spills, formalin exposure, and it makes sure that we are handling that specimen properly.
Yeah, spills are kind of a scary event, right? And, you have somebody who's, in the procedure as well, that you're kind of mid-case when that happens. So that means the case is going to take longer. There's other risks that are associated with patient outcomes related to having a case and extended time under anesthesia. But Melanie, maybe you could give us a little bit of a background on, what is your experience with the awareness around the risk, and what do you remember being the appropriate response to a spill, from your days in the OR?
Well, it's funny that you would say the appropriate response, because really it wasn't maybe the appropriate response, but it was more what we did. And so when I started in the operating room, kind of like Michelle said, we had those boxes of formalin that had the little spigot on it, and you just go into the room and turn the little spigot on, fill up your little specimen container with as much or as little formalin as you just decided looked good, and then you would send it to the lab. And, I'm sure it splattered on me more than once, and I'm probably sure I just reached my arm back, rubbed it down my scrubs, and dried my arm off, and off I went. I mean, there wasn't a lot of education in my facility that I started in about formalin other than, hey, don't spill this. It's got to stay in the container, whatever. But I know we dropped specimen containers more than once. And anytime we did, all we did was just go grab some blue towels and clean up the mess. I mean, we didn't follow any, I don't even know that we knew that there was any type of regulation or rules, saying what we needed to do, how we needed to treat this spill. Or if we did, maybe we ignored it. I'm not sure. It's just that was what we were taught. And by what I was taught was really nothing. It was just, hey, you need this, go get it, and then, use it. And so having maybe some regulation and rules and education about that is very helpful to prevent other people from being exposed to such a high risk when that can be prevented, and they don't need that.
Is that a common story that you hear, Michelle?
It is. I mean, people just have no idea what kind of risk they're exposing themselves to with the formalin. And even when we do a decent job with the education piece, it's really hard to wrap your head around that risk unless you are really, really well-versed in what those terms mean.
So what should that response look like? Melanie's kind of saying we got a blue towel and we mopped it up. When you have a potential exposure, just as we're educating the audience, even before we talk about UltraSAFE and how we can reduce the incidence and the risks that can come up, because this sounds a lot more common than I think people realize, what should the appropriate response to a spill be? So
our SDSs really are incredibly helpful. And I encourage everyone, if you're dealing with any sort of hazardous chemicals, make sure that you are familiar with the SDS sheet, because it's going to tell you exactly what you need to do in case of a spill. And in case of formalin, there is a protocol for basically deactivating the formalin, right? So typically you have to have a spill kit on site. And if it is considered a small spill, in each institution determines what those volumes are. But if it's considered a small spill, you would use your spill kit. But a lot of times these spills would be grouped in the large spill category, which means that you're going to have to call for a response team to come in and actually take care of that spill. In those cases, the OR can be shut down for as long as it takes them to mitigate that spill. Some of our best customers have come from a reaction to an incident that happened. And what I would say is you are so much better off if you can be proactive instead of waiting for an incident to happen and reacting to that.
The unfortunate reality, and it's not just in healthcare, it's in many walks of life. The unfortunate reality is a lot of times we don't implement a process improvement until we've had an incident. And so I think that's where the education piece really comes in. And I love how you're emphasizing the need to be proactive with these things, especially when we talk about just, the staffing situations in healthcare. I mean, sometimes the environments these days, it really presents some challenges with retention. And I think, having a culture of employee safety and really having the employees back can really do a lot to address that challenge with staff retention as well. As you developed UltraSAFE, I know obviously managing exposure, preventing those exposures, and employee safety is a real big part of it. But what were some of the other things that were going on in the operating room from that sort of outside perspective from lab and pathology did you feel like also could be improved upon?
So, as I said before, our founder is passionate about patient care. And one of the things about pathology specimens is that we really have to do a meaningful job of tracking the time to fixation. So we want to track our cold ischemic time. How long is it before the specimen is placed in formalin after it's removed? And then how long is it in the formalin before it is handled by pathology? And our instrument, we wanted to make sure that it could address those needs. And so by using our instrument, you are capturing that data exactly when the specimen was placed in formalin. Not only that, but you're also documenting who the attending individual was for the specimen, which is also a requirement. So we're capturing two key pieces of data that are really meaningful for impacting downstream testing for our patients.
So does that data that you're capturing feed into the charting for the patient for documentation, or is it separate?
We keep it separate because there's such a sensitivity to patient health information at this point. And so we have basically designed UltraSAFE to be able to provide you with that information without the sensitive HIPAA information. So by using patient medical record numbers rather than patient names and dates of birth, you can tie that into the patient record. So,
okay, Michelle. So before we get any further, the burning question I really want to know is what is formalin even doing when we're putting it on our specimens? Why are we using it?
So formalin is what we call a fixative agent. And there's several out there, but formalin is the gold standard. It's what all of our downstream testing is based on, is a specimen is fixed, quote unquote, in formalin. And what that's doing is it's stopping the autolysis process in the tissue. So what our goal is to maintain the specimen integrity as best we can so that we're demonstrating good architecture within the tissue. To do that, we have to cross-link proteins. And so without getting too much into the weeds, what we're basically doing is we're stopping the degradation process of that tissue. And that way, when the pathologist in the laboratory look at it, they're looking at a snapshot of exactly the state of that specimen when it was in the patient.
Oh, that's interesting, because the OR that I was recently in, our solution to the whole formalin issue was to not have formalin in the OR. And so we would just take our specimens in the specimen container, and then they would have to be taken to lab, where lab would then put them in the formalin and do whatever. But that can affect your specimen information because of the timing of when it gets formalin put on it. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, Melanie. The longer that specimen sits without formalin, the more that tissue degrades. And there's a lot of specimens that will start to take on that autolysis look, which impacts the results downstream.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, obviously when we're taking specimens, we're doing it for a reason, and we want to know what's wrong with the patient, what the problem is, and we can very much hinder that process if we're not immediately putting that formalin on there. So that's actually very interesting. I learned something today. Cool.
So essentially, is formalin acting like a preservative?
It is.
So before we go any further in the conversation, I know that I keep saying formalin because that's what I was taught, but really it's formalin, isn't it? There's actually, it's a different word, right?
It is. And it's funny that you say that, Melanie, because I've experienced that in multiple conversations with nurses, but not just nurses, even just the regular lay people. They just, for some reason, they'll call it formalin instead of formalin. And formalin basically it's a 10% neutral buffered solution that is derived from formaldehyde.
Interesting. And that's what gives it its ability to be a preservative and to capture that information that they need. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Cool. Okay. So I have one story. And I want you to tell me what you've seen on the statistics after I tell you about this coworker of mine. But I have a coworker friend who has been in the operating room since the early 1980s. And she, all OR all the time ever since she started as a nurse. And she has a lot of like respiratory asthma type issues. And she always would say every time she would have a coughing fit, every time she would have to be like, hold up, I can't breathe. I know it's because of the formalin that spilled back in 1990 something. And it spilled all over the OR. And she's down there on her hands and knees, cleaning it up off the floor, like breathing in all those fumes. And it was a really big spill. And she will say to this day that I've not been able to breathe since I cleaned that up back then. Is that one of the side effects of exposure to formalin? Or is that what happens?
Exposure to formalin can have a lot of really damaging effects, and definitely issues with breathing can be one of them because of course you're inhaling the fumes. And so it's creating damage as you're inhaling the fumes. In addition to that, you can have a significant reaction as far as from your eyes. Your eyes can get incredibly irritated. It causes skin irritation, airway irritation, headaches, nausea. And these are all common side effects from overexposure to formalin fumes. And the really crazy thing is that it doesn't have to be so bad that you can't stand to smell it. It's just a prolonged exposure type thing that can really cause these effects.
Wow. Yeah. She talked about her eyes burning too as she was down on the floor cleaning it up. But
eyes watering and burning. My nose is burning. I can't breathe. I'm coughing. I'm nauseous. I've got a headache.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely makes you reconsider maybe the lackadaisical approach some of us have had or been given when it comes to our safety around such a very dangerous chemical.
So UltraSAFE is meant to mitigate these risks. And Melanie, thanks for sharing that story, because some people probably have a more egregious experience like that one, and others have something that they can kind of minimize and move on with their day and not necessarily realize the exposure that they've had. And so, Michelle, one thing I wanted to ask you about is you were talking about the spigot and sort of like the current state. Can you talk about literally how it is to use the UltraSAFE product to manage and handle formalin in a safe and effective way?
Yeah. So with our UltraSAFE, we really designed it to be incredibly easy to use because we know that the ORs are constantly rolling over staff. And so that was one really important facet, is to make sure that it was easy to use, that it was effective, and that it was going to really mitigate the risk for these employees. And then it functions well and fits in the workflow. So with the UltraSAFE, the nurse is going to take the specimen, place it in one of our patented buckets, close the lid, take the specimen to the UltraSAFE. They'll scan the bucket, scan the patient ID, and then place the bucket into the chamber. Once they close the door, the UltraSAFE will dispense the amount of formalin required based on the weight of the specimen. The unit will finish filling the bucket and alert the user. The user can take the specimen out of the chamber at that point and label the specimen, and the specimen is ready for pathology. And they've never even once been exposed to that formalin. The chamber is completely enclosed, and so there is no exposure to that formalin.
That's phenomenal. So even the spill risk is like almost nil.
Right.
Or is it zero?
You never want to say it's zero because somebody will find a way to make it happen. But it basically reduces your risk to almost zero.
So what about the time? How long does it take? Because obviously OR nurses care about time and speed.
Yes, I'm really glad that you asked, Melanie. So basically from start to finish, a standard, and we'll just call it a routine specimen, our middle of the road specimen is going to take maybe 90 seconds to fill.
Oh, okay. That's not long at all.
Oh, wow.
It's honestly not a whole lot more than what you're doing with the spigot, only you're not having to hold a specimen up there and maneuver that spigot. You just place the bucket in and you're actually able to conduct other tasks while it's filling, right? So I'm filling out my paperwork as I'm waiting for the specimen, or, I'm getting all of my transport bags and paperwork together.
Yeah, we're all about
and the
multitasking.
process is consistent too, right?
Yes.
Because it's the same amount of formalin every single time.
Exactly. So we standardize the entire process by standardizing the amount of formalin. We also capture that time. So a nurse isn't having to, when pathology calls and says, you didn't put the time and formalin on here, she's not having to guess what time it was. It's printed on the label.
Speaking of the labels, you described earlier that communication between pathology and the operating room, and sometimes there can be a breakdown and the accuracy of documentation, like you just stated there. But I think you also mentioned to me before we got started that there's barcodes, so that there really creates another level of automation, even in how the information is recorded.
Mm-hmm. So basically what we do is there's a barcode for each bucket. And so all of the actions that are conducted on that bucket, as far as filling, labeling, that sort of thing, is captured in the UltraSAFE software. So we can actually pull data based on a very specific barcode. And that barcode is actually going to be coded to the patient's barcode. So if that patient barcode is their medical record number, that's what's going to be on that printed label when we place it on the bucket. So we don't put the patient's name or date of birth or HIPAA information in there. But if that goes to pathology, there's a way for them to look and see, okay, this is the medical record number, and they can tie that back to the patient.
It ensures that the specimen actually belongs to the patient that you're providing the results on.
Right. So it's going to have that barcode that's going to have the patient's medical record number. In addition to that, they're going to have their patient label on there. So there's another double check in the system for that pathology assistant to make sure that they have patient matching information.
Do you know how many times I've fielded phone calls from lab because we screwed it up? Me particularly screwed it up, or anybody else in the OR?
Well, and yeah, I mean, we're only human. And, by automating a little bit of this, we take some of the guesswork out.
I like that. All right, so Michelle, I have a question about the specimen containers that are used in the UltraSAFE. My experience with specimen containers, we just have all these different sizes. You just kind of randomly pick which one you want. It has a little screw-on lid, and off it goes. Is it kind of the specimen containers we're used to, or do y'all have a different type of container that's used in your machine?
They are similar to the previous containers, but we have some modifications that we've made to make them work with the instrumentation. So the first thing is that they're made of really sturdy plastic. We really wanted to mitigate any kind of risk as far as spills. And so making sure that we had a high quality plastic for the container was important. The specimen containers also have a proprietary lid that has a bicuspid valve on the top. And so that's how we're able to administer the formalin into the bucket without opening the lid in the chamber. So basically, specimen gets placed in the bucket. Our bicuspid valve lid goes on top and gets snapped into place. And then it goes into the chamber for formalin filling. The nozzle is going to come down and it's going to penetrate that bicuspid valve, fill the container with the appropriate amount of formalin, and then as it pulls back up, of course, the bicuspid valve closes it back up, and then there's a flap that goes over the top that the nurse presses into place, and now the specimen bucket is sealed. The buckets also have a nice handle that makes them easy to manage. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've carried my fair share of like ice cream buckets and containers when we've had larger specimens that had to go to lab. So I like that. And with that valve on top, if once you pull it out and it's full, say you fumble it and drop it, it's going to stop nothing's going to leak out of that valve that's on top, right?
So as long as they have put the flap into place, there will be no spilling. Cool. And if the flap hasn't been put into place properly, you're still not going to have a large spill.
I like that.
Yeah. The bicuspid valve is a very innovative way of handling this. And then in addition to that, we have a variety of sizes, everything from 1 liter up to 10 liters. So a lot of times the accounts will ask us, okay, so what do we have? So we have a variety of size options, just like you currently do. And you just pick the bucket based on the size of the specimen.
And then the container determines the right amount of formalin, and you don't have to sit there and guess and eyeball how much you need to put on it. And I think I said formalin again instead of formalin, but it's formalin that goes.
Well, Michelle, this was a great interview. And, I think exposure and managing exposure, standardizing processes, improving documentation, having checks and balances. These are just all some of the things that you've addressed. And, I like the collaboration too, from lab and pathology with the operating room. You have experts from one area. So how do we make sure that we have a tool or a product that is really going to help streamline that and get a consistent result every single time. So thanks so much for sharing all that information and for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Justin. It was a pleasure. We're really passionate about employee safety and creating a safe work environment for our healthcare workers. And so I'm really passionate about this particular piece of equipment because it is directly connected to the safety of our employees.
Well, I do want to let everybody know how they can get more information. They can go to your website. We're going to have a link in the write-up or on the smartphone app. If you've downloaded the First Case app for iPhone or Android, you can go to milestonemed.com. When you get there, click on specimen handling, scroll down the page a little bit, and you will see the UltraSAFE right there. We'll also have a direct link to product details, videos. You can also request a virtual demo or an on-site demo right there and ask for the local rep to reach out to you. The email is info@milestonemed.com. And then the last thing, Michelle, is that you have continuing education credits for nurses on this topic. And so that's something that they can reach out to you and you can provide an educational CE approved program as well.
Yes, we have a CE approved program through Fiedler. And we're happy to present it at any of your institutions. You just need to reach out and get scheduled with us.
Excellent, Michelle. Great job today. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Michelle Bell, Applications Manager at Milestone Medical, talking about the UltraSAFE product to manage chemical exposure, specifically formalin, in the handling of specimens. I think that staff safety piece, Melanie, is number one, but secondarily, it does standardize a process. I like that you can multitask while UltraSAFE is doing the work and adding the right amount of formalin to the specimen that'll then be transported to the lab and pathology, and just that communication between the two departments. But, ultimately, I feel like this is just an area that people have low awareness on. And I think it's great to be able to educate on the topic as well.
Yeah, I think that awareness I think that's really the right word. I don't think people really are aware of the severity of exposure to formalin. And really even to some extent, maybe why they're using it, why they need to use it, why it needs to be used correctly. And so educating on what it's doing, learning why we're even using it, but then also having that standardized usage of this chemical. So it's always used the same way. People aren't being exposed to the dangers of a chemical. Your staff is safe. Your patients are getting their specimens accurately covered in formalin. It's going to the lab without any delay for them having to call back down and track you down to get the information they need. I just think it's a winning setup for staff and for patients when it comes to handling specimens.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this vendor spotlight. I do want to remind everybody that you can visit their website, milestonemed.com. You just click on specimen handling, and then you will be able to scroll down a little bit and click on UltraSAFE, or you can just go ahead and click the link that we'll include in the write-up for this episode, whether you're finding us on LinkedIn, Facebook, maybe you're finding us in our smartphone app, etc., and you'll be able to get product details, videos, request a virtual demo or an on-site demo, and get connected with your local rep, as well as they've got educational opportunities with CEUs. So definitely take them up on that as you try to increase awareness in your facility, and you can email them at info@milestonemed.com. I do want to remind everybody that the best way to listen to the First Case podcast is to download our smartphone app. We'd also love it if you just engaged with us on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn and Facebook, as I mentioned before. But if you could share an episode or comment on an episode, we'd love to hear from you. And speaking of hearing from you, maybe there's one of these podcasts you've listened to that really made a difference in your daily practices at your facility. We would love to hear about that as well. And if you have ideas for future guests or topics that could be featured on the First Case podcast, send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. On behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this Vendor Spotlight on First Case.